Perek Bet. Now, after all of that, let's get into the business. Perek Bet. Vaya'al malach Hashem min hagilgal el habochim. Translations are so misleading. Okay. Vaya'al malach Hashem min hagilgal el habochim. From Gilgal to Bochim, somebody went up. Who went up? Who came from Gilgal to Bochim? Malach Hashem. Now, Malach Hashem can be many things. He's translated this here in this website as the angel of God. And again, that's going to be the major subject of this discussion. What does the word Malach here mean? I'm going to leave it as untranslated for the time being, because that's our first subject. Who or what is this Malach? So this Malach of God came from Gilgal, we know what Gilgal is, to Bochim. Bochim is a city we have yet to understand or see, and it's actually in the story, it's named Bochim. So we don't necessarily know where this is. Some suggest it's Bel, some suggest it's Shiloh, some suggest it's some other city. We don't necessarily know where it is. And so those two pieces of this opening verse are a mystery. Who is, what is the Malach? What's the from Gilgal to Bochim? And then, just 1 second. Okay. So let's just go on a little bit, and then we'll come back to all of this. The Malach of God came from Gilgal to Bochim. He said to the people, he said to Klal Yisrael, he said to whoever was there, he spoke. And he said the following: I brought you out of Egypt. Obviously speaking in the name of God. I brought you to the land that I promised to your forefathers. I said I will never abandon, never just this covenant with you for eternity. But that was conditional. I asked you something in return. Not to make a covenant, not to make a brit with the inhabitants of this land. To destroy their altars, to destroy their idolatry. And you didn't listen to me, meaning, open parentheses, go back to everything we learned in the first chapter and everything we learned in the last 12, 13 chapters of Sefer Yoshua, that at some point or another, the process of removing the Canaanites had completely from the land and removing the idolatry from the land stopped short of its goal. And they made britot, they made covenants and agreements with the Yoshvei Haaretz, and didn't destroy all the idolatry. Mazot asitem, what is this that you've done? And therefore, in response, v'gam amarti lo agaresh otam mipnechem. So I said, I will not drive them. I had promised I would drive them out from the land of Canaan for you. I won't do that anymore because you have failed in this first step. And therefore, they shall become for you like thorns, and their gods shall be a snare or a trap for you. Which is essentially the threat in the Chumash, the concern. Don't make a brit with them, lest don't remove them from the land or their idolatry from the land, lest they become a snare and a trap for you. Here, God says, because you have not done part A, I will not do part B, and in fact, they will become for you a snare and and thorns in your side. So we'll come back to Pasuk Gimel at another time. Today, for the most part, I want to deal with the question of the faith and some other issues here as well. It happened, it was, as this Malach Hashem spoke these words of Bnei Yisrael, Vayis'u ha'am et kolam vayivku. The people raised their voices in prayer in tears, and they cried. Vayivku. And they named the place Bochim, ostensibly because Vayivku, they cried. So the most significant characteristic of the moment, with the tears of the people, they called the place Bochim. Vayizbechu Shem Hashem. They brought sacrifices there, which is one of the reasons they suggest the place was in fact Shiloh, which would make sense at this point. The Mishkan is in Shiloh. But the gathering there and the significance of their conversation with the Malach Hashem and the tears that it evoked gave them the suggestion to name the place Bochim. Up until this point, Pasuk Hey is one piece. That's our subject for today. From Pasuk Vav, the rest of the parak is going to be already an introduction to what I call part two of the book, all in its entirety. These opening 5 verses are the close or the completion of the first part, which we started in chapter 1, listed all the tribes that did not complete their process of removing the Canaanites and the idolatry from the land, and the result was this message of this Malach Hashem. Okay, so there's several subtopics that we need to address in this context. The first is who or what is this Malach Hashem? It's translated here as angel of God. We'll see in a moment that is complicated, and why that's complicated. So that's the first question. Who or what is this Malach Hashem? And the random reference, Vayal Malach Hashem. This Malach Hashem came from Gilgal to Bochim. And the second is the nature of this message. What's his tochacha? What's the musar that this Malach Hashem is giving to the people? The reference to the Brit, the reference to removing the people, the Canaanites in the land, and then they're crying. What's the significance of the crying? What's happening in this little vignette, if you will?
I mean,
because that's where it stops.
Sorry, was there a question? This, when is this happening?
Oh, and that's the other question, which is when this is happening. Again, if I divide here at the end of verse 5 to verse 6, this is sort of a culmination of what we learned in Perek Aleph. So Perek Aleph took us on a journey through the early years of the book of Shoftim, carried us even into events of the story of Barak and Devorah. Devorah and Barak against Sisera. That was sort of the latest we saw. And so there is a suggestion that Das Mikra makes the suggestion that commentary that this is in fact taking place after the events of Devorah and Barak. From my perspective, because it's an introduction, its time frame is less critical, meaning this whole first chapter was an overview of what we're going to see in the book of Shoftim, early years, etc. It's the aftermath of Yeshua and why they were unable to conquer or didn't conquer the parts of the land. And then there's this kind of culmination or summary of this conversation between the Malach Hashem and the rest of the people. And that sets the stage. After that, the story is going to go back to Yeshua and the death of Yeshua, the death of Elazar, the rest of the story, and pick up from there. So let's start from the basic question of who or what is this Malach Hashem? An odd moment to have a Malach talking to the people. Translated here as the angel of God. A strange conversation. Suddenly a Malach appears. Who, what, where? If I jump to the source page for a moment, and you should have the source page in the chat, if not already by the email. The Targum, Yonatan, one of the earliest sort of Aramaic commentaries like Unklus and Chumash, we have a Targum and Navi. There's 2 of them actually, Targum Yonatan, Targum Yerushalmi. They're sometimes confused, but that doesn't really matter for us today. The Targum Yonatan Chazal attributed to Yonatan ben Uzziel, who's a Tana, translates the following. This opening verse Vaya'al malach Hashem min Gilgal. The Targum translates it as Uslik Neviya b'shlichut min kadam Hashem. A prophet came and spoke in a message given to him by God. In other words, the Targum suggests that the word malach here doesn't refer to an angel, despite the translation of Al Torah. It refers to a Navi, that a Navi came and spoke to them. And there's a logic compelling that interpretation, that we're dealing with a malach and not a malach meaning a Navi, and not a malach in terms of an angel, let's call it. And we'll see that is in fact how the majority of the Mefarshim understand this as well. I would say almost all the Mefarshim. Radak is an example. Vaya'al Hashem. He quotes the Targum. Navi b'shlichut min kadam Hashem. It's based on a medrash in Vayikra Rabbah. I'll come back to that medrash in a moment. So just to understand the context of the question, I gave you in page 2 of the, I think it's on page 2 of the source, but yeah, page 2 of the source page, a kind of overview of every reference, every type of reference of the word malach in Sefer Shoftim, which is really a reflection of the word malach as it appears throughout Tanakh. In other words, the word malach can mean 3 different things. And so in every place where the word malach is used, you have to ask yourself which of these 3 applications is being referred to. For example, we have a notion that a malach is simply a messenger. A person can send a messenger, and that's called a malach. We find later in Perek Zayin. These don't have translations. I'll translate it for you as we go, but I just want you to see the references. In Perek Zayin, for example, Gidon, one of the Shoftim, sends messengers throughout the land to gather the people together to fight. That's a messenger, that's a human being acting as a messenger on behalf of another human being. Similarly, Yiftach sends a delegation to negotiate with the king of Ammon. Vayomer Melech Ammon el Malachei Yiftach. The messengers of Yiftach, there's a delegation, there's a negotiation going on between the representatives of Yiftach and the king of Ammon. That's very common in Tanakh to use the word malach or malachim as human beings in the service of other human beings. On the other hand, there are references to the word malach as we understand it in the broader context, what we would call a malach Hashem as an angel, translated as the Torah translates an angel of God. That too appears in the book of Shoftim. There are several places where there are actual malachim, meaning angels, who come and converse with the Shoftim that we will learn about. Some of these stories are very famous. For example, the most famous perhaps is, I'll start with source 12, the most famous is Shimshon, or his mother, right? Eshet Shimshon. She has a whole conversation with this angel who comes to tell her that she's going to have a child, and then gives her instructions as to what she can and cannot drink and what rules she has to follow, because the child is going to be a Nazir. That's at the end of Sefer Shoftim. And there she goes running to her husband, and she says, "V'tavah isha v'tomer le'isha." That the woman comes and says to her husband, "Ish ha'elokim ba'elai u'mar'eu k'mar'eh malach ha'elokim." An Ish ha'elokim, meaning a Navi, came to me, but he looked angelic. He looked like an angel. She doesn't know who she's speaking to. She doesn't know she's talking to a Navi. She thinks she's talking to a person, and she's in fact talking to a malach. Then there's this whole, I skipped the whole rest of the chapter, there's this whole conversation. The Manoach asks to see the same vision. The malach comes back, and the Manoach offers him food, offers him lunch, and he refuses to take it, and then he brings soup and he places it before him. There's a flame for cooking this lunch that he made for him. And the flame goes up to heaven. And the malach goes up to heaven in this flame. And Manoach and his wife are watching, and they fall in their face, because right then and there they realize that he doesn't come back. As Yada Manoach, then Manoach realized that he was talking to an angel. He wasn't talking to a human being, an Isha Elokim, who looked like an angel. You have a very similar story earlier by Gidon, by Shimshon, so the second time by Gidon. You also have the Malach, Gidon says, I'll bring you food to this, Vayavo Malach Hashem, this Malach Hashem who comes to appoint Gidon to designate him and to give him his mission. Vayishlach Malach Hashem al K'tzeh HaMishenet, and this Malach Hashem, he takes the edge of his cloak and he touches the food, and there's a fire that goes up, Batal Eish Min Hatzor, and the Malach goes up to Shamayim, Malach Hashem Malach Meinav, and disappears. And then Vayar Gidon Ki Malach Hashem, when Gidon realizes he's talking to an angel. So certainly the word Malach, in Malach Hashem in particular, in Sefer Shoftim, can refer to an angel, and we've seen instances where it does. There's a third application of the word Malach. For example, in Sefer Shoftim Perek Hey, in the middle of Shirat Devorah, she writes, Oru Meroz Amar Malach Hashem. She's speaking in this Shira, she's speaking about herself, Ad Shekamti Dvorah, Ad Shekamti Em B'Yisrael, and she says, she curses the city of Meroz because they were supposed to come and fight and they did not, and she refers to herself as Malach Hashem, meaning Niviyaita, she was a Navi. And she's speaking on behalf of God. She's speaking in the process of Nevuah, and she calls herself Malach Hashem. So suddenly we see that the word Malach Hashem can also refer to a Navi, like Eshet Manoach, who said she was talking to an Isha Elokim who looked like a Malach. Okay? But there she says she was confused. But we do have references to the idea that a Malach Hashem can in fact be a Navi. So now I have a confused moment, because I have in the book of Shoftim the use of the term Malach Hashem to refer to a Navi. I have the use of the term Malach Hashem to refer to human messengers. And I have the use of the Malach Gidon or Malach Yiftach, not Malach Hashem. And I have the use of the term Malach Hashem to refer to angels. So I come back to our text. Vayal Malach Hashem min Gilgal ala Bochim. Is this Malach Hashem an angel, or let's call it a Navi, or a human being? Somebody just posted, I saw a pop-up about the Sartzva Hashem and Sefer Yeshua. Sartzva Hashem and Sefer Yeshua, I would argue, is definitely an angel. There's reasons for that interpretation. I can explain that. If you go back to the Shiurim and Sefer Yeshua, we dealt with that a lot. But I'm going to review that now because that'll take us off topic. But let's go back to the source page for a moment. So I shared with you the Targum, which says that in this case, it's not an angel, it's a Navi. And the question is, why does the Targum insist on that? And I'm going to show you that it gets even more specific, because not only does the source, which is a Medrash, Vayikra Rabbah, say that this is a Navi, the source actually tells us who this Navi is. And that's the biggest mystery of all. We're going to name this Navi. We're going to identify this Navi. We're going to give him a name. Vayikra Rabbah. Vayikra Rabbah is talking about in general. It's the source upon which this Medrash is based. It's not our subject for now. And the Medrash begins with the statement, Nikra'u ha-Nevi'im malachim. There are many places in Tanakh where the Nevi'im are called malachim. Not angels, malach. Malach simply means messenger. You can be a messenger of a human being. You can be a messenger of God, and you can be an angel who's a messenger of God. Any of those three are possible. In this case, Nikru and Nevi'im Malachim, the Medrash wants to prove that it's possible for a Navi to be called a malach, for a Navi to be called a malach. For example, in Bamidbar Perek Chaf, we find the following pasuk: Vayishlach malach v'yotzienu miMitzrayim. God sent a malach to take us out of Egypt. Now, is that a reference to the malach hamavis, to the mashnus makat b'charot? Says the Medrash, no. Who's the malach in this case? Malach Hashem haya, Moshe haya. Who took us out of Egypt? Moshe took us out of Egypt. So you're calling Moshe Rabbeinu malach Hashem? Yeah. Why was he called a malach? This teaches us that the prophets were called malachim. Second example, our verse in question. Was it an angel? Not only was it a Navi, not only was it a human being, the Medrash takes this one step further to identify who it is. That's our next subject. How do we know who it is? Well, the Medrash says it's Pinchas. Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron HaKohen. Same Pinchas in Parshat Pinchas, same Pinchas in the story of Baal Peor, same Pinchas that will appear various places throughout Sefer Shoftim. So why is he called a malach? Pinchas b'shah she'ata ruach hakodesh shoreh alav hayapanim bo'arot kalapidim. Hayapanav bo'arot kalapidim. When Pinchas spoke, the ruach hakodesh, his face burned, his face shone like a torch, like Moshe Rabbeinu karan or panav. Then the Medrash quotes the story of Manoach, which I showed you in a moment, where she was clearly talking, which is in reverse, where she's talking to a malach, but she calls him an Isha Elokim, because Sfurab Shu Navi Beinu Elam Malach. And then the Medrash quotes a final proof, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Mi Beit Av. This is what we refer to as a binyan av, a general principle, a guideline or a precedent that sets some principle in place for many places, that the Nevi'im are called malach. Opening chapter of Sefer Chagai, one of the Nevi'im, referred to as Chagai. Vayomer Chagai malach Hashem b'malachut Hashem. Chagai, the messenger of God, spoke in the mission of the message that God sent him on. Vayomer Chagai malach Hashem b'malachut Hashem. So clearly you see that the Nevi'im were called malach. All this to prove what I just showed you in that chart, that there are three different applications of the word malach, and the reference in our pasuk could be any of the, well, it could be 2 out of 3. It clearly can't be a human messenger of another human being, because the text says malach Hashem. So he's not acting on behalf of Yiftach or Gidon or any other of them. But that leaves us the 2 possibilities. It could either be a Navi or an angel. What's compelling me to say that it's a human being, Navi, and not an angel? Which is what the Medrash says, right? So besides the Medrash saying it, is there something compelling me in the pshat of the pasuk that says this really, logically, should not be translated as an angel, but really should be translated as a Navi? And here I want to point out a comment of the Rabbi, very powerful insight, very short, concise insight, but if we really unpacked it, it would be a sheer into itself. It says the Rabbi, this malach was a Navi. Why? שלא ייתכן שידבר מלאך השם לרבים יחד בזה האופן. Says it's not possible for it to be an angel because an angel would not speak to all the people gathered together as one. Meaning, there is only one precedent in all of Tanakh for an angel or representative of God, or even God himself, to speak to all of the people as one. And that's Ma'amad Har Sinai, and that's only for Moshe Rabbeinu. In every other instance, a malach, where we have a real malach, a malach meaning an angel, they speak to an individual. The malach in Sefer Yoshua that was referred to earlier is speaking to Yoshua. The malach who speaks to Moshe in the burning bush is speaking to Moshe. There is no example in Tanakh of a malach, referring to an angel, speaking to all of the people together. Because that would be a revelation. That would be like Ma'amad HaSinai. That's not what we're dealing with. We're dealing with tochacha. We're dealing with a chastisement. We're dealing with mussar. That's not the role of a malach. And in the text, it says that he appeared to all the people. Vayal malach Hashem min Gilgal el habochim. He comes from Gilgal. First of all, he's not coming from Shemayim. He's coming from Gilgal, which is a place. So the Mepharshim say that's where he received the nevuah. And then he comes to the people in Bochim where they're going to be able to bring sacrifices. That's most likely Shiloh. And he says to them, and he's giving the Musar, I took you out of Egypt and I brought you to this land and I told you not to make a breach with the people. That's not a malach speaking. He's speaking to the people. And when they heard the words of this malach, El Kol B'nai Yisrael, El Kol B'nai Yisrael, he's speaking to all of the people. He's speaking to all of the people. This is not the role of a malach. This is the role of a navi. So from a pshat perspective, says the Rabbi, I don't need the medrash to tell me that we're dealing with a navi. So again, I come back to, I've shared with you in the past, translations by definition of commentary. I learned that from the Chama many years ago. No such thing as a translation that's not a commentary. This particular translation, I think is wrong, but that's okay. Malach Hashem is a navi. Okay, so we've resolved one mystery in this text. A navi speaking to the people. The bigger mystery is, who is the navi? It's not Yeshua, clearly, because Yeshua, first of all, in this context has already died. Right? We're talking about a nevuah that is received further down the line in Sefer Shoftim. And second of all, it would tell us if it was Yeshua. So, who is it? Now, Chazal is a general approach, from a methodology perspective. Chazal do not tolerate anonymity of key figures. That's a midrashic methodology. Anytime you have an anonymous figure or an anonymous persona, even an anonymous animal, like the chamor that Abraham saddles to take on his journey for the Akedah, Chazal will identify some aspect of who that chamor is. Chazal, from the methodological perspective, they have a shita. They do not leave things anonymous, and so they'll always look for some way to identify anonymous persona. In this particular case, they identified this navi as, where's the medrash, as Pinchas. And they don't just derive it. They take it as an assumption. How could you say it's a malach? After all, it's Pinchas. So it has to be identifiable. So for the remainder of today's shir, and then probably part of next week, I want to unpack this assumption. Why does the medrash assume that the navi in question is in fact Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron HaKohen? How does that enter into this passage? And what's interesting about it is that the Mepharshim don't argue. There's almost no, at most they suggest they don't reference Pinchas. They say it's a navi without giving it a name. But the vast majority of the Rishonim, the Pashtanim, the Bag and the Radak and Rashi, they all assume that this is in fact Pinchas. How do we get to Pinchas? And the truth is that Pinchas is a persona that we're going to encounter quite often in the book of Shoftim. We're going to see him, if I go from, this is chapter 2, just take a quick glimpse for a moment. I'm going to jump to the end of Sefer Shoftim, to the story of Pilegesh Begiva, which is really the last story in the book. In Pilegesh Begiva, which is in Parachaf, we have a civil war between the tribes of Israel and the tribe of Binyamin. It's a very tragic story, and they gather together. Binyamin commits a terrible crime. They go to avenge that crime. They also commit a crime. It's actually two civil wars in one. I'm not going to unpack the details of it, except for one reference, which is that when they want to go to war, they ask the Kohen Gadol with the Urim V'Tumim. Vayishalu b'nei Yisrael b'Hashem. They asked God, okay, should we go to war or shouldn't we? Or who should lead us in war? The ark was there. This is in Shiloh. Ufinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron omed lefanav b'yamim hahem. Who is the Kohen Gadol? None other than Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron HaKohen. And so they asked the Urim V'Tumim with Pinchas's guidance, should we go to war and shouldn't we? And the answer was yes. And the rest of the story is not our issue for now. What is fascinating is that that's at the very end of the story. That's at the end of Sefer Shoftim, and suddenly you have a reference to Pinchas by name. Now, Sefer Shoftim covers a period of time of about 350 years, little over, about 330, 350 years, unclear exactly, but for sure at least 300 or 350 years. If the stories are sequential and Pelagish Begiva is the last story of the book, that would make Pinchas 350 years old, at least, probably 400 years old. So there is a medrash that suggests that Pinchas is the same persona as Eliyahu Navi, and therefore he's kind of this larger-than-life, lives forever persona, and we can go there. I'm not going to go there. Much simpler approach, which is the approach that appears in the classic medrash of biblical chronology called Seder Olam Rabbah, is to say that this story, Pelagish Begiva, and its counterpart, story referred to as Pesach, are both much earlier stories. They really chronologically are at the time frame of the beginning of the book of Shoftim. They're just placed at the end as a kind of a postscript for reasons that we'll get to and study at length when we get to the end of the book. There's about the transition between Shoftim and Shmuel. But in and of itself, those two stories are much earlier, which means that Pinchas is a persona. He's the Kohen Gadol at the beginning of the book of Shoftim. So if there is a Navi / Shofet / leader of the people in a post-Yehoshua, post-Elazar, remember Yehoshua dies and Elazar Kohen dies. They both die at the end of Sefer Yehoshua. And if there is a persona to be identified in the post-Yehoshua, post-Elazar Kohen world, it makes sense for it to be Pinchas. He's mentioned by name. And we'll see it midrashically as we go through the Sefer. Pinchas appears in many different places. By name, explicitly at the end of the story of Pelagish Begiva. So from that perspective, one can, you could argue that Chazal simply assume Pinchas appears at the end of the Sefer in Pelagish Begiva, but that's an early story, so Pinchas must be the operational leader at this time. So if there's a Navi who's speaking to the people and is referred to as Malach Hashem, he's referred to as a kind of a divine character, because that's what the Nevi'im were, and that's certainly what the Kohen Gadol would have been perceived as, and speaking in the name of God, it makes sense for it to be Pinchas. That's one simple explanation. I think there's a much deeper explanation and a much deeper link between this message and Pinchas, which leads us to not just the context in the book, but also the message that this Navi is presenting. And that's really where I wanted to go. This Navi comes to them from Gilgal to Bochim. Gilgal was the very first place where they came into the land of Israel. So he's carrying in this message a symbol of the entire period of history from the entrance into the land of Israel to this moment, especially if it's from Gilgal to Shiloh, you sort of get the whole gamut. And if it's Navi, if it's Pinchas, if it's a Kohen Gadol, you really understand the depth of this moment. And he says to them, let's go back to the story. It began, I brought you to this land that I promised, And I made one request. I said I would never break my covenant with you. I made one request. The atem lo tichletu brit liyoshvei haaretz hazot, not to make a brit with the inhabitants of this land. The definition of the chait in this case is that you didn't listen to me and you made britot with the inhabitants of the land. Now, up until now, we've talked about not displacing the Canaanites, not removing them from the land, or not allowing them to become, or the enclaves, the little bits of Canaanites that have been remaining in the midst of the people of Israel, and therefore the cultural, spiritual influence that they could have over the people. Lo tichletu brit is a much bigger issue. I want to understand this request. I made the request not to make a brit with them. What's a brit? Why is the brit so significant? I said, I would not have abandoned my covenant with you. I made a request for you not to make a brit with Yoshvei Haaretz. It's much bigger than not to settle in the cities that you've conquered. To make a brit with Yoshvei Haaretz is a much more significant piece. A brit is a dual contract. A brit means a treaty, an agreement, a way of establishing that two equal partners or parties in a contractual agreement, arrangement between them. That's a brit. Like God and Israel made a brit between them because it was a contractual arrangement. It was a recognition of the small. I will be your people. You will be my people. I will be your God. That's a brit in the broader sense of the capital bet. What is the brit with the Yoshvei Haaretz? And the truth is that there's a direct verse in the Torah that defines this violation of not to make a brit with the people. So let's take a quick look. Okay, that's an early alert. That's a pre-alert in Bet Shemesh. So I'm going to keep going, and if anybody else gets a siren that needs to go into a room, then just grab your phones and join us from there if you can. We're just going to keep going because, as I said at the beginning, I'm already in the mamad. Let's jump to Perek Zayin of Dvar. Dvar and Perek Zayin is really the place where this notion of the Brit and the danger of a Brit with the Yoshvei Haaretz is spelled out. Pasuk says as follows: when you come into the land that God will give you as a possession, many nations there before you that will be removed one way or the other. Either you will remove them or God will remove them. Various places in Chumash there are different models for how that is played out. 7 nations stronger and greater than you. God will give them into your hands, and you will smite them. You shall destroy them. Do not make with them a covenant. Why is the issue of a covenant? Do not make with them a brit. Next verse. Do not marry them or marry into them or have this cultural integration with them that leads to a kind of an equality between two nations and marry amongst each other and be part of one big happy family. You shall not let your daughters marry their sons, take their daughters marry your sons. Why not? Because they will lead your children astray. And lead them to worship other gods and other deities. God will be angry at you, and destroy you quickly. But this is what you shall do. You shall destroy their altars, and destroy altar, their monuments, Ashrayim Tigadayun, and cut down the Asherah trees that they worshipped, and burn their graven images in the fire. Meaning, you cannot leave a remnant, cannot establish a museum to idolatry. You cannot create a remnant of idolatry in the land of Israel. It's too strong a draw. But if I look at the sequence here of these three verses, lo tichot lehem brit, not to make a covenant with them, not to marry them, that lest they lead your children astray, that's it. And therefore, what must you do? You must destroy their altars. That's exactly what the Navi said to them. I said to you, lo tichotu brit l'shvei haaretz zot, meaning mizbechotehem titotzun. You shall break their altars. If I took the verses from Devarim and I inserted them here, it starts with don't make a brit with them. It ends with you shall destroy their altars. And in between I had don't make a brit with them, don't marry them, don't integrate with them, and don't let them lead you into idolatry, but rather mizbechotehem titotzun. In other words, I'm missing something in this verse. I'm missing 3 dots. 3 dots. Remember 3 dots? Dot. Insert here all that is described in Sefer Dvar in that opening passage. Because that's the beginning, the bracket. So essentially, if I trace the sequence, go back to the Torah for a moment, if I trace the sequence of these 3 prohibitions, or 3 references, not to make a brit with them. A brit means there's a sense of equality. We're a nation in this land, you're a nation in this land, we're going to share the land, we're going to share equality, we're going to have equal status, brit. And therefore integrate socially and culturally, and marry them, and then eventually the issue of idolatry. If I wanted to find a case precedent for exactly this sequence of being in the land, making a brit with the local inhabitants, leading to integration, marriage, relationships, etc., that eventually leads to idolatry and therefore angers God, what historical moment, story, single episode highlights exactly this sequence from lo tichot lehem brit to lo titchaten b'hem to ki yasir bincha me'acharai. Single episode that highlights in 3 psukim exactly this sequence.
Yeah. I'm saying Nehemiah. I don't know.
We'll get to Nehemiah next week. This sequence in exactly this
Cosby?
Exactly right. That's exactly the story of Cosby ben Tzur and Zimri ben Salom. Cosby bat Tzur and Zimri ben Salom. That's exactly the story that we have in Parshat Chukah, in Parshat Balak. Vayeshe, and we looked at this a little bit a couple of weeks ago when we looked at the story of Shimon. What decimated Shimon, and the suggestion that this was all Shevet Shimon. Vayeshev Yisrael Bashitim, sitting on the east side of the Yarden, in the land that should have eventually become the land of Reuben, Gad, and Shimon. In particular, Vayeshev Yisrael Bashitim, Yachal Ha'am is not Moab. Because they're in this land, and because they saw themselves as a kind of dealing with the local inhabitants and integrating with them and trying to address the relationship with them in a much more kind of equal setting and equal footing. They began to be drawn to socially. Result, the people called and said, listen, you want to go out with my daughter? We're going to the local temple on coming up. Come and have a feast with us in our temple. So they came and they ate. And they bowed down to their gods. And then they connected to the idolatry of Baal Peor, which was the idolatry of the Canaanites. And before you know it, we went from the Brit, the Vayeshev Yisrael Bashitim, to the Veloti Tchatem Bam, to the Znut of Bnot Moab, to the idolatry of Vayishtachavulu Elohim. It took 2 psukim. Vayikar Hashem Yisrael. God got angry at them. No surprise. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe. God said to Moshe, Kach et Yoshe ha'am v'kartam Hashem neged hashemesh v'yashem charon Hashem Yisrael. God said to them, punish these people who have done terrible things. Vayomer Moshe Shoftei Yisrael et Grish Anashim, and it's been named the Baal Peor. Anybody who worshipped this idolatry called Baal Peor should be put to death. Fine. But idolatry is a punishable by death violation. There's a much bigger issue here. Before you get to the final step of idolatry, they took a step in between that's much more amorphous. And that's Vayachalam Niznot B'not Moab. They began to socially integrate with the daughters of Moab. There's no violation there. There's no prohibition there that's explicit in the Torah. Even the question of marrying a non-Jewish is not necessarily explicit in the Torah. It's very complicated. So v'nei ish m'bnei Yisrael ba v'yakrev el echav et hamidyanit. So a leader from Israel, later we find out that it's the Nasi of Shevet Shimon, came with a Midyanit by the name of Kozbi Batsur, and in public, to demonstrate a violation and a defiance of Moshe, Leinei Moshe, Leinei Kol Adat Bnei Yisrael, and he took him in public. And every ounce of Jewish morality and sensitivity is in violation here, but there's nothing Moshe can do about it because technically they haven't worshipped idolatry in this act. So what's Moshe going to do? Result is, Moshe, Aaron, the leadership, they're standing there in tears in front of the Olam Moed, in tears. Why are they bochim? What should they be doing? Kozbi Batsur, Zimri ben Salu in the front of the Olam Moed. Yeah, you do something. What do? Moshe, Aaron, the leaders of Israel, they're standing there and crying. Standing on the sidelines is a young Kohen by the name of Pinchas. Pinchas ben Elazar and Aaron Kohen. Pinchas is watching. Kozbi Batsur, Zimri ben Salu, and Moshe and Aaron and the elders crying at the entrance of the Olam Moed. Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron Kohen, Vayakom mitoch ha'edah, arose from the midst of the congregation. Remember that phrase. We're going to come back to it in a couple of weeks. Vayakom mitoch ha'edah, arose from amongst the people, meaning he has no status here. He's not Kohen Gadol. He's not part of the leadership. He's not part of the Eidah. He's not a Moshe. He's not an Aaron. Vayikach romach biyado, took a spear. Vayvoach ad ish Yisrael lakuba vayidkor et shnehem et ish Yisrael et ha'isha al korata. He stabbed and killed them both in one act. But that's out of money and stopped the plague. Okay, the rest of this verse we'll unpack next week. We'll unpack that. But that's the story of Kozbi Batsur and Zimri bin Salu, and that's the story of Pinchas. Pinchas rises out of the congregation to deal with this particular moment, which is the symbol of what happens when you give the Canaanites a status of Brit, Vayeshev Yisrael Bashitim, that leads to the Znut, Lo Titchaten Bam, that then leads to the idolatry. You have to stop it in its tracks. Came along Chazal and said, you know what? This Malach Hashem here is Pinchas. Why? How did they connect the dots besides the Brit and the symbol of this what sent Chazal to Pinchas and said, this moment is Pinchas? There's a hint. There's a textual reference. Chazal looked at this and said, this is Pinchas.
They call it Bochim, and the elders were crying.
The reference, the emphasis in this story, it's not just, it's especially if it's Beit El, or if it's Shiloh, or if it's some other place we're familiar with, that doesn't even get referred to. And that's because at the end of the story, the people lifted up their voices and they began to cry. And they called the name of the place Bochim. But it goes beyond the question of the naming of the city or the naming of the place or the symbol of the nevuah. It's the moment in time. The tears in Sefer Bamidbar, there's tears in Parsha Balak / Pinchas, right? The transitions from one Parsha to the other. But the tears at that moment of Moshe and the congregation were tears of recognizing the depth of the tragedy, recognizing the significance of the moment. Why were they crying? Why were they crying? Because they couldn't do anything. They felt helpless. For whatever reason, we go through the whole halachic analogy of why Moshe felt that there was no technical violation that he could then accuse them of, even though it was an abhorrent, immoral act. But not every abhorrent, immoral act can be defined in the technical books of the Shulchan Aruch to the point where you can say, okay, they execute them because they violated X, Y, and Z. And so their hands are tied, they're crying, until Pinchas said, essentially, Shulchan Aruch, a hand in the hair, I don't care, and he took a spear and he speared them. And that's why it's called kana'ut, because he acted zealously. But the tears in that moment represent the inability of Moshe and Aaron to act, and therefore the need for Pinchas to arise and do something rash that he could have been held accountable for until God came to give him God's endorsement. That's exactly what you have here. Assuming for the moment we're dealing with Pinchas, Pinchas comes and he says to them, we have history repeating itself. You are engaging in a very dangerous precedent. You've established not just the ability for the Canaanites to remain as enclaves amongst you, but you've made britot with them. You've given them equal status. You've given them equality. You've said to them, we can integrate with now one big communal family of nations in this land. You know what that means? That the next step is going to be they're going to marry them and you're going to have idolatry with them, etc. When God said everything that you have to do, including destroying their altars, it means this is exactly Pinchas speaking. This is Pinchas who fought against the tribes of Israel building an altar on the other side of the Yarden. This is Pinchas, who we'll see many times throughout this Sefer Shoftim. This is Pinchas from that same Parsha Pinchas, who stood up, who understood the depth of the tragedy of what's going on. And what does he encounter? What's the response of the people? They cry. He moved them to tears. Ah, how wonderful. He moved them to tears. Wonderful. Maybe not so wonderful. What do the tears represent in the story about Peor? The sense of helplessness that Moshe and Aaron felt and therefore couldn't do anything about it. What did they Yisud Kolam Vayivku? They lifted up their voices and they cried. Was it what Pinchas wanted them to do in this moment? Think about it from this perspective. What was Pinchas hoping what reaction was Pinchas hoping or anticipating to get? Soon, violate the Britol, tear them up, change the course, go out and deal with the Canaanites, etc. I don't think he was anticipating, or I don't think that the Navi was hoping that the reaction would be everybody would stand there and cry. Tears are a reflection of despair and helplessness in this moment. They felt they had done wrong. Okay, they cried. They brought a couple of sacrifices. And then the story continues. Well, that's the end of that. That's it. There's no continuation. We go back to Yeshua's death, and then Vayamad Yeshua, and Yeshua's generation finished, and then we're going to talk about the Shoftim and go on from there. There's no reaction. They lifted up their voices in tears, and that's it. And that's exactly where the intersection between the Brit and the tears said, in the minds of the Medrash, said, this is the story of Pinchas. All over again. This is Pinchas. And so when you find a Medrash like that, that takes an anonymous persona and gives it a name, but it pulls a name out of a story, the first thing we do from a Midrashic perspective, analysis of the Medrash, is to try to see the connection between the two stories. And here it jumps off the page. B'ezrat Hashem, next week, what we'll explore is a much larger canvas of the relationship between the tears and where they reflect the sense of helplessness and where they reflect and what was the anticipation. We're going to kind of take this Pinchas and the tears story and look at it in a broader canvas of Tanakh. Somebody mentioned before as Nehemiah. We'll look at that story. We'll look at Pinchas and Eliyahu. We'll look a little bit at the story of Eliyahu himself. And B'ezrat Hashem, then we will compare, and we'll come back to Yeshua Pinchas. And I hope to do it in 1 year. We'll do it in 2. It's even better. B'ezrat Hashem, next week, we'll continue from here and unpack the story of Pinchas and Yeshua and their personalities as they define the period of Sefer Yeshua versus the period of Sefer Shoftim. With that, I'm going to stop sharing and answer any questions you have.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much for this interesting class. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, always.
Rabbi Shulman, could you talk a little bit more about the designation of a Navi? Clearly, a Navi could be a Kohen. We know that from other Naviim that are Kohanim.
So could a Shofet.
Right. So, but in many of the Naviim, God comes out and basically designates a Navi. So here, when we talk about Pinchas with Briti Shalom, so he's clearly from the Kohanic genealogy. God gives him a sort of a special designation of Briti Shalom. Did you think that designation also entitled him to be a Navi?
The short answer is that first of all, the Kohen Gadol was always a Navi, because in the sense that the Kohen Gadol always spoke in the name of God, whether it be through the Urim V'Tumim or whether it be through some other communication. They always turn to the Kohen Gadol to understand what God's intent was.
Right, that's the Urim V'Tumim idea.
Okay, but it speaks to a larger role that the Kohen plays. Malachi describes this, the Kohanim are supposed to ideally play a much more direct leadership type of spiritual role, which pre the world of the Chachamim meant the world of Nevi'im. Whether they were Nevi'im or not depends on the Kohen. You had, for example, with the end of the period of Shoftim, you have Eli. Eli was a Kohen / Shofet / may have been a Navi, right?
Yeah.
At some point earlier, Shmuel takes over that role, and you have this conversation between Shmuel and Eli. So it's not unprecedented to have a Kohen serve as a Navi. Most famous Kohen Navi combination is Yirmiyahu. And so you have, so that piece of it doesn't, but Chazal aren't coming at it from the perspective of the Kohen Gadol is the Navi. Chazal came at it from the perspective of Pinchas was the Navi because of Pinchas's unique role, and that's what we're going to talk about next week.
Okay.
How it comes back to them. But Pinchas's role was unique because Pinchas's message and throughout his life was his kind of his calling, if you will. But that the Navi, that the Kohen should be the Navi, should not surprise us.
Hakarat Hatov, thank you so much.
No problem, my pleasure. All right. Stay safe, everybody, especially those of you in this room.
You too.
Thank you,
And Toronto.
Rabbi.
Toronto's had its share this week. So anyway, we should all pray for more peaceful and good times for everybody.
Amen.
Thank you. Good night. Maybe a quiet night.
Amen.